Hey there, class. It's Faisal coming at you with your class for May 20th, not 19th. For ENG4U, grade 12 university. So, before we get into the King of the Raft and the next story, let me talk a little bit about your short answers. First of all, I figured it would be a good idea if I did an example, just so you know exactly what I'm looking for roughly. So remember, it's about 4 to 6 sentences in total. So here's an example question, right? It's different from your question from yesterday. So this is the teacher example question. Why did Margaret Atwood decide to make this story multiple choice? All right, so that's can be our question there. So here's my answer. Margaret Atwood made this story multiple choice because she wants to analyze the different ways that writers approach endings in the span of different genres. You have the fairy tale ending, you have the dramatic endings, and then you have the exciting action movie endings where there's a tidal wave or a revolution. By showing all of these endings together, she is trying to ridicule them and show the readers that our idea of what a romance is distorted and two-dimensional. In her viewpoint, all these endings are equally cliche and worthy of ridicule. So, that's 4 sentences long, right? It might look long on the screen because I've got it in big font, but, if I were to put it into 12, it would be like that, right? So it's not that much. They're meant to be quick answers, but I do want you to have these 3 things, right? It needs to have a clear position, right? So I need to know exactly what you think. I don't want you to just tell me what happened in the story. I need a clear position. I need complete sentences, right? That's very important. And I need your reasoning and logic with evidence, right? So you don't have to quote or anything like that because again, these are supposed to be similar to short answers in a test, right? Instead, I want clear reasoning and logic with your evidence. Not too long, right? If you give me like 3 paragraphs for this, it's too long, right? You shouldn't do that. But also not too short, right? So if you give me 1 sentence, that's not enough either, right? So that's what you're supposed to do for these particular answers, right? So this example question here is your example of what you are meant to be putting in for these things, all right? So remember, each of the stories is going to have one of these. Speaking of stories, let's get to the next one. So, first of all, if you had trouble with this Google Book thing, right? I went ahead and I just took a bunch of screenshots of it. So there's this link here on the classroom, or you could go to classwork and see material, right? So story postings for King of the Raft, right? And that will give you the pictures of for reading the story, right? So that's what you need to do. I don't know why they're not in order. Well, page 1 is at the end for some reason. But nevertheless, that's what you should do if you were not able to use the Google book, right? To just click, and there you are. So, this story is a story that certainly can be a little bit confusing. And before we talk about its content, in order to understand the story, you need to understand a little something about the author and where he's coming from, because this was written by an Aboriginal Canadian. So, Aboriginal people in Canada have a very tragic history, and it has a lot to do with colonialism. Now, every country in the world is touched by colonialism in one way or the other, right? I know many of you come from countries in Africa or Asia, and certainly most countries in the world have that experience of colonialism in their history. But when it comes to the Canadian Aboriginal experience of colonialism, uh, they essentially got it a lot worse than any other country, right? And I'll try to explain that using, well, let's just use the simple numbers. So, the Aboriginal people are also called the First Nations because they were first, right? They arrived in Canada before anyone else, right? And today in Canada, this is from Statistics Canada, They represent 4.9% of the population of Canada, with the other 95.1% being, well, people that aren't them. So, I want you to think back, especially those of you who are first generation immigrants and came from elsewhere. Think back to your own country and imagine your people, your main ethnicity, right, being reduced to 4.9% and other people being 95%. Now, granted, there are places in the world where that has happened, right? But it certainly has happened here in Canada, where the Aboriginal population has been reduced to a minority of minorities. Now, this is not a history class, so I don't have time to go through every single detail here. I'm not going to go through the dates and everything like that, but I'm going to give you guys, especially those of you who perhaps have not studied this before, just a basic overview of what happened to the Aboriginal people. So, when the European colonizers came, uh, many Aboriginal tribes were wiped out, especially on the east coast of Canada, closest to the Europeans. Some were destroyed outright with guns. Others were destroyed by disease brought by the Europeans, right? Specifically, a disease called smallpox, right? Smallpox had been in Europe for quite some time, right? But it had not been in Canada before, right? So, as we all know from the coronavirus epidemic, right? If a disease is around for a long time, people start to build antibodies. But if it's new, it really can deal a lot of damage. So many Aboriginal tribes were wiped out by smallpox, and the Europeans, by the way, were happy that that was happening, and in many cases promoted it. So you had a lot of Aboriginal tribes and people slaughtered in one way or the other when the Europeans first came in that way. Then you have, after the society is decimated, you have the Aboriginals sent to places called reserve. These red dots you see on the map are what we call Indian reserves, even though we don't call them Indians anymore. Um, so these are where the Aboriginal tribes were sent to. As you can see, by the way, there's a lot more on the west coast than there are on the east coast, and that's because, again, the Indians that were over here, I shouldn't say Indians, the Aboriginals that were over here were the first to encounter the Europeans and their smallpox and everything like that. So they didn't survive, whereas it took longer for them to get to the west, so there are more reserves there as a consequence. Nevertheless, these reserves are tiny plots of land that the Aboriginals were given as they were pushed out of the rest of the country, right? So basically, when Canada was colonizing Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, right, and there was a lot of farmland there, right, they would say to the Aboriginals, all right, you guys stay out of the rest of this land. It's ours now. And, we're going to put you in these reserves. And, everything else belongs to us, right? So, Aboriginal people, well, they didn't have a choice but to accept that because the colonizers had guns and the Aboriginal people did not. So that's why these treaties were sort of forced upon them, right? And they were then forced into these reserves, right, or reservations. So, but it doesn't stop there, right? So first we've had the physical destruction from guns and disease. Then we've got the reserves. Then we've got the third blow that Canada inflicts, which is residential schools. Right? Residential schools are schools created by the government in partnership with the Protestant and Catholic churches, right? And those schools had children forced out of the reserves, right? So they would where's there? They would go into one of these reserves and they'd say to the parents, give us your kids, right? Regardless of if you want to send them there or not. and we're going to take them to these schools, right? And on the surface, that might not sound as bad to you, but, well, they're forced away from their families, right? And they're brought to these schools where they're taught three things. First of all, they're converted to Christianity, right, from their native religion, right? Forced conversion is the first part. Second, they're taught English, right? And at the same time, forced to stop speaking their own language. And third, there's a whole bunch of physical and sexual abuse that's taking place at these schools, right? So, you know, there were kids that were literally kidnapped away from their parents. And you can imagine, without parental protection, these kids were, brutalized. So, this happened over the course of hundreds of years, right? Or I should say, yeah, about 200 years, I would say. I would need to go back and check the dates. But nevertheless, what they would do is they would take these kids from their families, right, put them through the schooling system. Often the kids would forget their own language because they're forced to only speak English, right? Physically and sexually abuse them. And then after that, right, they get sent back to the reserves, right? So it's not like you go into a residential school, you learn English, and then maybe you can come to Toronto and get a job. No, they were sent back to the reserves, and what that did is you had generations of children who couldn't talk to their parents, right? Because they are removed from their own place, right? And they also have kids that have been taught by their teachers that their parents are heathens, right? That their parents, are backward savages and everything like that, right? So that's what Canada did to this population, and the result is Aboriginal culture and society was decimated, right? And the damage is something that is still being repaired to this day, right? Justin Trudeau issued an apology for the reservation schools, as did the previous Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, right? So, there's been a lot of attempts to repair this damage. So, that brings us back to King of the Raft. So, first of all, let me apologize to anyone that tried to read the story before 6:30 p.m. on Tuesday, right? Because Google Books, I've never used it before, and I just want to point out that it's not my fault what happened here, right? Because I look at the Google Books, right? You see page 71, 72, right? And then, what? 77? And then 74, and then 75, and I'm like, what happened to page 73 and 74, right? And I found out, oh wait, it's up there, right? So the fixed version is now posted on the Google Classroom, right? Where is it? There it is. Right, page 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's the story. And my apologies for the confusion. If you read anything about something Mexican, then ignore that. Sorry, I know the story is confusing enough as it is. I will take this into consideration next time I use Google Books, that apparently sometimes pages are out of order. So, again, my apologies for that. I didn't realize. I just saw the story and I was like, oh, okay, that's the story. There it is. Right, I didn't think they'd put the pages out of order for some reason. Anyway, so I hope you got to read the story properly. Anyway, let's talk about it. So, The King of the Raft. It's another postmodern story, just like much Aboriginal fiction often is. And the first thing you'll notice about this story is the naming thing, right? Because the names of characters are constantly changing, right? We see here, there was a raft in the river that year, put there anchored with an anvil just below a bend by one of the fathers who worked away in Buffalo, who could spend only every other weekend, if that, at home. The one of the mothers whose husband worked the land and came in from the fields for every meal muttered, as she set the table, that raft was only way the father who worked in the city was able to pretend he cared about his sons. Her husband, also one of the fathers, who had once, when young, gone across the border to work and then, unhappy there, returned, could not answer, soaking the dust of soil from his hands. So, you'll notice no names, right? Everyone is called either a father or a son or a boy, right? It's all done without names. And, well, there's perhaps a reason for that, right? That we will perhaps, this might be something we discuss in our next seminar, even, right? Why there aren't any names. But that's the main confusion when it comes to this story. But I'm here to help you out, and I'm here to tell you that even though it might seem you're dealing with a lot of different characters in this book, there are really only two that you are worried about, right? Let's see. You've got there's this boy here. This is the second page, third paragraph. The boys use that raft in the murky green water to catch the sun, or their breaths on, or to dive from where they try to touch their mud bottom. One of the younger ones also used to stand across the current to the other side, trying to see that field of corn there, the last bit of land that belonged to the reserve. Beyond it, the highway ran, a border patrolled by a few cars flashing chrome in the sun or headlights through the evening blue, like messages from the city. Every one of the boys used the raft several times that summer to get across the river and back, the accomplishment proof of their new masculinity, and once the younger one, who spent time looking at that other land, crossed and climbed up the bank there and explored the shadows between the row of corms, the leaves like dry tongues, along his naked arms as he came to the field's far edge where the asphalt of the highway stood empty. So, there's one boy in there, this younger boy, who I'm going to call the highway boy, right? That is essentially the protagonist of the story. He's called a lot of different things throughout the story, right? So I can even put an AKA here, right? He's also called the boy who almost drowned, right? And other things like that. But it is all referring to the same character, right? So that is one of our characters here. And then there's the other character, who is, of course, the King of the Raft, right? Let's quickly look at him here. Years later, one of the older boys... Wait, hang on, let me just find the King of the Raft's introduction. Oh yeah, here it is, right there. "I'm the King of the Raft," he yelled, challenging the boy who had seen the highway to win that wet wooden square, and a battle was joined, and the day was wet and fair, until the King of the Raft, to show his strength to the rest of the boys still on shore, took a hank of the highway boy's straight hair in hand, and held the highway boy underwater till the highway boy saw blue fire and almost drowned. Right? So, the King of the Raft is the boy who is, dunking the highway boy under the water, right? So, he dunks the highway boy under the water, right? So he nearly drowns him. And we see that after that, the King of the Raft is in a whole lot of trouble, right? Because, well, he almost killed one of the other boys, so obviously the highway boys' parents get angry at him and everything like that, right? So it might seem like a lot of characters are around and that it's a lot of different boys, but really they just are the same boys being called different things, right? So that is the first thing to know about this, right? Is that, there might be a lot of different names, but essentially two characters: Highway Boy, King of the Raft. Now, this story is heavy on symbolism, right? Which, as you all know, is when put that up. There we go. When something or someone in a story represents an idea, right? So symbolism is very strong in this story, right? It's a very, again, postmodern story that is sort of um, trying to bring across a message, right? And it's important to look at some of the symbolism that's happening in this particular story. So I'm going to call your guys' attention to a simple one, right? And that is the color blue, right? Let's take a look here. We've got, I think, 4 instances of the color blue in this story. First one, and probably the most important one, is... where is it? I just read it. Yes, when the King of the Raft is on page 3, by the way, is trying to drown the highway boy, right? What does the highway boy see? Well, he sees blue fire. Right? So that seems to suggest, because he's drowning, that blue fire means death, right? So let's even put that down. Blue fire, it means death, right? That's, there's death over there. And in fact, if we look at the King of the Raft's hair, right, we'll also see, and the boy who almost had drowned found he both feared the King of the Raft and missed the blue waves in his blue-black hair, right? So the King of the Raft has got some blue in his hair too, right? So perhaps there's something to connect it with there. But there's another time we see blue fire and this blue-black hair, right? And that's on the next page, page 4, right, where it says here, well, first of all, the King of the Raft meets the boy again, and he has some beer, right? He has some alcohol, right? And over there, we see this line. Let's see. The King of the Raft was going away with his father to live in Buffalo in the United States, and thought the boy who had almost drowned could use what was left of this beer the king's father would never miss. The boy who had almost drowned sipped from his bottle of sour beer and heard the rain beginning to hiss at the end of the culvert. He crawled and looked out in time to see the blue fire of lightning hit a tree. In the flash, she saw again the waves in the king's blue-black hair, the grin that offered another beer. Right? So, here it is. We see blue fire comes when he's drowning and when the king offers beer. Now, it's a common stereotype in Canada that Aboriginal people have problems with alcoholism. Now, that, first of all, is not, it is a stereotype, right? Many Aboriginal people, in fact, most, do not have such problems. But it is true to say that after the reservation schools, or residential schools, decimated Aboriginal culture and people, right? And you had these broken families where the kids couldn't speak the language of their parents, right? After that happened, yes, there were certainly a lot of social problems in the residential or reserves, right? Including alcoholism, right? So we could perhaps say something here. Now, the story does end with the King of the Raft dying, right? We don't know exactly how, right? He went there, and it says at the bottom of that same page, a rumor came around about his going to work in the city, and in winter another one claimed he had died. The boy who had crossed through the rain thought about going down even quicker in winter traffic. Then a newspaper confirmed the death in a traffic accident, the Rain Boy read. So that is how the King of the Raft ends up dying. He goes to America, he leaves the reservation, and then he is killed, right? So this is a story that has a bit of a mysterious aura to it, but Well, my challenge to you guys today will be for you to try to figure it out. So let's look at the question of the day. So let's get that there. Yes. The question is, in the short story King of the Raft, what does the raft symbolize, and what is the message being told by the story? So we have a boy come in and, say, I'm the king of the raft, right? A raft that you might have noticed is being used by all of the boys together, to do this and to do that, right? And then all of a sudden this boy comes in and says, well, I'm the king of the raft, right? So I want you to tell me what's the symbolism here and what message is being told by the story. And you might want to consider, while you try to figure out the meaning, some things like the blue fire, right? You could also think of, the death of the king of the raft, or the death of the king, right? And you might want to also think about Aboriginal history, right? Because I'm giving you a big hint that's really important here. All right, so that will be your question of the day, and you're going to answer it in the exact same way that you're answering the short story question for today. I can see only 5 of you have brought it in yet, right? But there'll be another one right here, right? This question, and you will answer that as well, right? So the idea is that there are going to be 4 of these by the end of the week, and that's all going to add together to be the equivalent of a test. All right. So, let me know if you have any questions. I'm sorry about the confusion with the story earlier on, and we will leave this there for now, and I will wish you all good luck with that question. The cats... Oh, here, it's a cat. The cats have a message too. Meow. Oh, tell them about the seminar. Oh, right. Yes. One last thing. So, I'm being told that there is a biology test on Thursday that people have to do, right? And apparently it involves going on to camera, so they can't do it on Thursday either. Let's move our next meeting to Friday at 2 p.m., right? I'm going to be firm on that, right? Let's just say Friday, 2 o'clock. If you can be there, right? If you can't be there, then you're going to have to make it up with the next one, okay? But that's the plan for now. Friday at 2 o'clock. Meow. I'll be there. Okay, good. So Dragos will be there, and I hope you guys will be there too. All right, so I will see you guys tomorrow, and I hope you're all having a good day. Meow. Bye.